This video contains classification of overheads and segregation of semi-variable overheads. It contains 5 illustrations. It is in Chapter 4 named, Overheads, in the textbook Cost Accounting. This is more suitable for B.Com, B.B.A, M.Com and M.B.A of all universities of India and foreign countries. It is suggested to study through laptop. Presented by Dr.M.Wilson. Chapter 4. Overheads. Overhead is otherwise called as indirect cost. Indirect costs are those costs which cannot easily be identified in the cost center. It could not be allocated to a particular cost center. It would be apportioned to the cost center since these costs are commonly incurred for 2 or more cost centers. On the other hand, direct cost can easily be identified in a cost center. It should be allocated to the respective cost centers. Direct cost constitutes direct material, direct labor and direct expenses. Like that, indirect cost constitutes indirect material, indirect labor and indirect expenses. Classification of overheads. 1. Element-wise classification. 2. Functional-wise classification. 3. Behavior-wise classification. 1. Element-wise classification. A. Indirect material cost. B. Indirect labor cost. C. Indirect expenses. A. Indirect material cost. Indirect material cost is those material cost which could not be easily identified in the product. It cannot be allocated and it can be apportioned to the cost center. Example: lubricating oil, fuel, cotton waste, stores spent for repair and maintenance, wax, nails, etc. B. Indirect labor cost. Indirect labor cost is those labor cost which could not be easily identified in the product. It cannot be allocated and it can be apportioned to the cost center by a common basis of apportionment. Example: salary paid to storekeeper, foreman, supervisors, workman compensation, holiday pay, allowances to employees, etc. C. Indirect expenses. Indirect expenses are those expenses which could not be identified in the product. These expenses could not be allocated and can be apportioned to the cost center. Example: insurance, depreciation for fixed assets, taxes, canteen expenses, rent and rates, lighting and heating, hospital expenses, etc. 2. Functional-wise classification. A. Manufacturing overhead. B. Administration overhead. C. Selling and distribution overhead. A. Manufacturing overhead. Manufacturing overhead is otherwise called as factory overhead. It is the indirect cost incurred in the manufacturing of the product, i.e., in the factory or manufacturing division of the organization. It includes indirect material, indirect labor and other indirect expenses connected with the factory. This cost should be apportioned to the relevant cost center on the suitable basis of apportionment. Factory overhead is added with direct material, direct labor and direct expenses to ascertain the prime cost. Hence, factory overhead constitutes some portion of the prime cost. B. Administration overhead. Administration overhead is the indirect cost incurred for the performance of the administrative function of an organization. It includes indirect material, example, stationery, indirect labor, example, salary to the staff of the administrative department, and indirect expenses, example, conveyance expenses, entertainment, refreshments, etc. C. Selling and distribution overhead. Selling and distribution overhead are the indirect costs incurred for the selling and distribution department. Payment of salary to sales manager, salesman and other expenses are included in the selling and distribution overhead. It includes indirect material, example, stationery, indirect labor, example, salary to the staff of the selling and distribution department, and indirect expenses, example, conveyance expenses, refreshments, etc. 3. Behavior-wise classification. A. Fixed overhead. B. Variable overhead. C. Semi-variable overhead. A. Fixed overhead. Fixed overhead are those indirect expenses which remain constant up to certain level of activity. It will not change due to the changes in the volume of production up to certain level. These expenses should be incurred even though there is no production in a period. Since total fixed overhead remains constant, fixed cost per unit of production will vary according to the variation in the units of output. The fixed cost per unit will increase due to the decrease in the volume of production and it will decrease due to the increase in the volume of production. Examples for fixed overhead are rent, salary, interest, etc. B. Variable overhead. Variable overhead are those indirect expenses which varies according to the variation in the unit of production. Hence, the total variable overhead increases due to the increase in the unit of production and decreases due to the decrease in the unit of production. The variable overhead per unit remains constant irrespective of the units of production. Examples for variable overheads are electricity, canteen expenses, consumable stores, etc. C. Semi-variable overhead. Semi-variable overhead are those indirect expenses which are partly fixed and partly variable. It contains fixed element and variable element of indirect expenses. Example: telephone charges, electricity charges, remuneration for salesmen with monthly salary plus commission based on sales, etc. Segregation of semi-variable overhead into fixed and variable overheads. Semi-variable overhead should be separated into fixed overhead and variable overhead for the purpose of cost ascertainment, cost planning and cost control. Hence, each semi-variable overhead should be classified into two parts, namely fixed and variable. It is a complicated process and requires some techniques to be adopted. The following are the important methods for segregating the semi-variable overhead into fixed and variable overheads. 1. Graphic method. 2. High-low points method. 3. Average method. 4. Simultaneous equation method. 5. Least square method. 1. Graphic method. Under this method, semi-variable overhead at various level of activities should be plotted on a graph paper. The x-axis of the graph should represent quantity and y-axis should represent cost. The plotted points at the graph represents the semi-variable overhead at different level of activities. From the plotted points, a straight line of best fit which pass through most of the plotted points should be drawn. The straight line touches a point at y-axis. The point represents the fixed portion of the semi-variable overhead. Hence, the remaining amount of the semi-variable overhead is called the variable overhead. Illustration 1. Find out the fixed overhead from the following information by graphic method. Solution. Segregation of fixed overhead from semi-variable overhead. The graph is presented here. It is clear from the graph that the line drawn through the plotted points representing the different level of activities cuts the y-axis at a point. The point measures the y-axis is 1,500. Hence, the fixed overhead portion of the semi-variable overhead is 1,500 rupees. 2. High-low points method. Under this method, the two level of activities, i.e., the low level and high level, should be ascertained. Then the semi-variable overhead for these two levels of activities should be noted. The variable overhead per unit can easily be ascertained from these values. The variable overhead per unit is the ratio between the difference in the cost to the difference in output units between the two level of activities. That is, variable overhead per unit equals difference in semi-variable overhead divided by difference in output units. Illustration 2. Find out the fixed overhead and variable overhead from the following particulars by high-low point method. Solution. Calculations are presented here. Fixed and variable overhead for different levels of activities are presented here. 3. Average method. Under this method, the semi-variable overheads for different level of activities should be grouped into 2 or 3 sets. Then the average for the grouped output units and semi-variable overheads should be calculated. These data are to be plotted in a graph and the plotted points should be joined so that the line cuts at a point in the y-axis. The distance from the origin to the point measures the fixed overhead. Illustration 3. Find out the fixed overhead by average method from the data given below. Solution. The data can be grouped into 2 categories as follows. Graph is presented here. It is clear from the graph that the straight line cuts a point in the y-axis at 2000. Hence, the fixed overhead is 2000 rupees. 4. Simultaneous equation method. In this method, the straight line equation y equals a plus bx should be applied. In this equation, y represents total cost, a represents fixed overhead, b represents variable overhead per unit and x represents output units. Semi-variable overheads for any 2 periods should be selected to apply in the simultaneous equations. Illustration 4. Find out the fixed overhead and variable overhead from the following information by simultaneous equation method. Solution. Calculation of fixed and variable overheads is presented here. 5. Least square method. Least square is an important method of regression analysis. By taking the output units at different levels as x, and semi-variable overheads as y, the variable overhead per unit can be ascertained through the equation mentioned here. Illustration 5. Calculate the fixed overhead and variable overhead per unit by least square method from the following. Solution. Calculations of fixed and variable overheads are presented here. Fixed and variable overheads are calculated here.